Thank you, Eric. Our next speaker is Robert Holmes with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and he's going to talk about the ongoing work that the department has with respect to developing flows for the protection of fishery resources and work and efforts that they have at the regional level, as well as site-specific approaches focused on answering specific questions related to drilling down to what they really need to figure out and addressing the study and designing it to answer those specific questions.
Great. Thank you, Erin, and thank you all for being here today. Today I'm going to be talking about question-driven flow criteria. What are the questions that we're asking in our assessment of in-stream flow needs for fish and wildlife and their habitats across California? What are some of the methods and models that we're using to address those study questions? And then what are some of the considerations that we have to also consider when implementing these types of studies? One of the most important things that I can say right off the bat with doing these types of work, and it's similar with any types of environmental type of studies, is the importance of upfront planning. For example, study plans and getting those study plans out, getting them reviewed, that sort of thing. So I'll touch more on that later. I'm also going to be talking about the design and implementation of two types of studies. Today, two studies will be site-specific studies. These are intended for use in the water allocation and permitting process here at the State Water Board. And then another, which is a regional study that we're calling a regional study. It's actually a pilot study that we are participating in or participating with the Central Coast Regional Water Quality Control Board on. And that's more of providing the type of information that provides sort of status and trend type stuff like a 305B, 303D type reporting. So before I get started, I want to talk about terminology. Generally, there are three types of, or three terms that you guys have probably heard throughout today and other times. Flow criteria is the first one. These are basically just the numbers. If you go on our website at Department of Fish and Wildlife, a lot of what you see there are reports that present flow criteria. They're numerical standards. They can get used in a lot of different ways. They may or may not turn into flow recommendations. So flow recommendations are flow criteria that have been transmitted by our agency to the State Water Board and transmitted by our director to the State Water Board for their consideration in water allocation and basin planning decisions. They may or may not develop into flow objectives, which flow objectives are sort of the end process which are implemented by the board to balance and protect beneficial uses and public trust resources. So the In-Stream Flow Council has set forth some considerations that I'm going to mention today in my talk. Most importantly, it's important to understand there's not just any one flow level that a river needs to stay healthy. As you saw from the earlier speakers and Sarah's talk, there's multiple components of the flow regime that are needed to maintain the biological and physical habitat processes. The In-Stream Flow Council actually divided the flow regime up into 5 components, that being the hydrology, biology, connectivity, geomorphology, and water quality. So we actually use those components in all of our studies when we're designing and planning studies. It's not important that you address every one of them, but just that you acknowledge that those components are there. It's important to point out there is no set protocol for how to tie all those together. We recommend more of a multi-method approach when you're looking at in-stream flow needs to address those different components of the flow regime. And then last not least, always think in terms of flow regimes, not any one flow, there's not any one flow level, there's not any one method that does it all, so it's important to sort of think in the broader scale. When we're talking about methods and models, there are 3 general categories. There are standard setting methods. Those can be either referred to as sort of the bottom-up or top-down approach. One of them refers to how much water the stream needs to reach a desired level of protection. So there are certain biological methods that we have that do that. And then the top down, in the contrary, how much water needs to be left in the stream. So there are just two different ways to look at it. There are lots of different methods. We have protocols that do all of this. Incremental methods is the next category. These are your habitat versus flow relationship type models. We use a lot of those. As Julie mentioned, the PFSIM model, there's River 2D. They're generally drawing relationship between flow and habitat. And that jumped ahead. And then the last category is holistic methods, and these are the term used environmental flows. They tend to, the end product of the holistic methods is to present a balanced flow, whereas the upper approaches tend to provide more of the flow criteria, which are more the numbers that can be used in the other processes. Site representation is a very important component in flow studies. It's so important to us that as part of our studies, we make it regular practice to invite the stakeholders out to our studies. We determine sites either by targeting sites or selecting them randomly or other methods. We invite the stakeholders out. We want to walk the stream with them. At the end of the day, it's really important to have concurrence that the sites that we have ended up choosing to be as part of our study, that everyone agrees that they do represent the overall area that we're interested in assessing. Hydrology is probably one of the most important, if not the most important variable in an in-stream flow study. All of the earlier speakers have mentioned that. From our standpoint, it doesn't matter whether you incorporate hydrology in your study from the front end, such as what's being done on the Tier 1 approach, or on the later than the back end, which is kind of what we do in some of our studies as well. But it has to be incorporated. It's really important to know what you're asking for, if you're developing flow criteria, how that relates to the flows that are out there both naturally and in potentially an impaired state. So now I'm going to move into the site-specific studies. I'll be talking about two studies that we have done at the department, the Big Sur study, which is complete, and then the Ventura River. It's really important to point out that our decision-making policies and mandates directly tie into the questions that we ask. And so why do we ask the questions that we ask? On these two particular studies, the questions are directly related to the Water Action Plan, Prop 1, and then also the stream flow requirements, or as set forth in the Public Resource Code. So on the Big Sur was placed on our Public Resource Code stream list, which means a flow study has to be done by the department or another entity, and then those flow recommendations have to be transferred to the Water Board for their consideration. Since it's in the Public Resource Code sort of realm, it generally, and those flow numbers could be used in potentially decisions where there could be hearings involved. We thought a higher level of defensibility is needed. So we actually have multiple components of that flow regime, as you can see, of the 5 components. And then with each one, there are multiple questions. So today I'm going to be talking about 3 within the Big Sur. That's going to be the Steelhead microhabitat preference. Those are rearing criteria, the criteria that get used in habitat models, Steelhead passage, and then longitudinal flow gains and losses. So the first question is, what are the Steelhead microhabitat preference criteria for the Big Sur? So these are the habitat suitability criteria. They're really super important part of a modeling exercise that looks at in-stream flow needs. They're basically the biological component. They account for what the species is doing, how they're selecting habitats, depth, velocity, substrate cover, that sort of thing, those 4 general categories. So there are different ways to answer this question. We could have very simply just went to the literature and said, okay, so we want to look at rearing steelhead. What are some criteria that's been developed in the literature, and plug those into our models? As I mentioned, this is a Public Resource Code stream, so we wanted a higher level of defensibility. So the next step is, well, we could have looked for neighboring streams. Well, actually, the closest stream that we have steelhead criteria in was from the Trinity River. So the Trinity's up in the north coast, the Big Sur's on the central coast. Yeah, they're not really side by side. So the other option was, hey, just go out to the stream, and if you have fish actually in the stream, then you can follow them around and design a study that assesses the habitat they're selecting, sort of let them tell you what types of habitats and microhabitat variables that they are selecting. So that's the approach that we took. We developed site-specific criteria. In the end, we collected data for over 6,000 fish species in that particular, or not species, observations. The second question is, what are steelhead passage flows? This is a real common question for a lot of coastal streams. How much flow is needed to promote successful passage, both for adults to make it, anadromous fish to make it upstream to spawning areas, and then for the juveniles to make it out, to assess how much flow is needed for connectivity between habitats during the summer. So there are different ways to answer this question as well. This is the PRC stream. We thought more defensible is better. We could have used the State Water Board actually has a fish passage formula called the QFP. You basically plug in the watershed drainage area, the mean annual discharge, and then the minimum depth of the fish species that you're interested in looking at, and you can get a number that's pretty close. The other options are there's actual site specific methods, such as transect methods, where you can go out. We have a critical riffle standard operating procedure where you can go out and you can measure flow depths across critical riffles, measure the velocities, and put together a relationship between depth and stream flow at those critical riffle sites. And then another option is using two-dimensional models. And this is a generally accepted approach in the literature. Again, we thought, we need the more defensible route. So we decided to use the two-dimensional models. We surveyed the anadromous zone of the river, which is about 7.5 miles, identified 21 critical riffle sites. Out of that, we narrowed it down to the 5 most critical. And then we did transect measurements at those. And then at 2 of those 5, we actually developed two-dimensional models for. The two-dimensional models are really useful for looking at areas that have complex channels, transverse flows, and especially split thread channels like you see on one of the pictures up there. Gains and losses, this is another common question, needing to know, okay, how much water is actually in the stream at any given point versus what you're measuring at another point. So on the USG, on the Big Sur, we have a gauge that's about 7 miles upstream from the ocean. And so it's important to understand, well, what you're seeing at that gauge upstream, is it actually what's in the stream all the way through those 7 miles? So we actually had monitored, and there was some reason to actually suspect that the lower part of the river actually was considered a losing reach. There would be less flow than what you're seeing at the gauge in that lower reach. And that's also common in coastal streams. So we actually used monitoring data to calculate about a 7 to 8 CFS loss in that lower reach. Then we actually had a gauge installed within the lower mile, and that sure enough, the difference between the 2 gauges was 7 to 8 CFS, depending on water year type, whether it was wet or dry conditions. And then lo and behold, in 2014, we have a drought. So the stream actually never got this low, at least during the study, but during this particular time period, we had a 7 CFS reading at the gauge, and sure enough, downstream, that lower reach was dry. So shifting gears to the Ventura River, the Ventura is a water action plan study. It's important for us to develop useful numbers that can be used to enhance flows through other efforts. Today I'm going to be talking, so these were some of the questions that I'm going to talk about today. Movement and survival flows. So what are the flows needed to move through specific habitats and survive? This is more of a low flow, summer flow type question. And then what's a low flow ecological threshold? What's sort of a minimum level that you want to maintain ecological processes? So the interesting thing about the Ventura is that it primarily was thought to be a passage study, and we put out a study plan. We identified sites. We have 3 sites that we're using two-dimensional models. One of them is a mile-long riffle complex that has multi-threads, and so that's been identified by the local water district as a potential barrier depending on flows. We put the study plan out. Everybody said fine, but wait a minute. The local surf rider, coastkeeper group said, we think it's really important that you guys look at minimum flows in the what's called the live reach, which is the downstream portion of the Ventura River, downstream of the intermittent reach. So we modified the study plan. We added some additional methodologies, such as the habitat retention method. It's one of our, they're all peer-reviewed standard operating procedures, and it's going to allow us to look at movement and survival flows. And then the second part of that question was the low flow threshold. and we're using the wetted perimeter method in that particular case. Again, this is another peer-reviewed standard method. It's in the Instream flow book put out by the Instream Flow Council as an accepted method to develop this sort of a threshold. This, however, doesn't answer everything. As you probably guessed, water quality is very important in that section as well. So we're going to need some water quality data as well. The water quality component most often in stream flows is temperature and DO, and so we're meeting to discuss a plan to look at those variables as well. So now I'm going to shift gears into our regional study example. This was a partnership with the Central Coast Regional Water Quality Control Board. We started out looking at, with an anadromous fish focus, what's the condition of these streams within the Central Coast region. How do they compare? How do they how healthy are they when looking at anadromous fish endpoints? So as we started doing it, we talked to the other regional boards on up the coast and decided, hey, we need to actually look at a bigger set of data here. So we have actually 40 streams all the way up the coast, starting from Mission Creek down near Santa Barbara County. And so the question we're asking there is how do flow conditions for aquatic life compare among these streams through time? So the most important component of the study, we had to select sites that had gauge data. If we didn't have gauge data, we'd have no way to know what the period of record is like, what flows have been on that stream over the past period of time. So as you know, that's really important. We're actually losing gauges faster than we're gaining them. However, I think that's starting to turn around with the Water Action Plan. So in this particular study, we were interested in real rapid, site-specific, don't spend much time on the stream, not intensive, use very minimal site-specific data. So we actually spend about 3 or 4 hours on a stream collecting our data. We're addressing all the 5 study components of the flow component as identified by the Instream Flow Council. And ultimately, we're hoping to put this together and have the sort of look of like a flow report card over time. Some additional questions that we're asking, this is really important. It could be really important for the water rights group here. When do these streams naturally hit certain flow thresholds? So we can develop a lot of different flow thresholds using site-specific criteria, using desktop methods. So we're actually doing a whole bunch of those, and we're looking at, okay, when do they hit these thresholds? Is there a chance when maybe forbearance periods, time periods when diversions might need to be heavily considered, whether or not they need to be ceased or not? So that's another component of that study. Promoting data and consistency and sharing promoting data consistency and sharing is a theme of the workshop. From our standpoint, Department of Fish and Wildlife, we recommend question-driven study designs. Do consider quality assurance. If you ask Will Hagen, he's our next speaker, he would tell you known and documented data, scientifically valid, and 2-stage peer review. He's going to go over that next. As I mentioned, study plans, get them reviewed before. I know it sounds simple, but even today, that doesn't happen at times. That's a great way to coordinate efforts as well. So what about professional judgment? I get asked this question a lot. Isn't that, I've heard, well, isn't that a bad thing? Shouldn't we be just using methods that, get you right to a number? And so in reality, none of the methods that I've mentioned today or have any of the speakers have mentioned or anywhere in the world are actually capable of making decisions in the absence of objective interpretations. So not only is professional judgment essential, it's actually required. And to not embrace credible professional judgment is actually not professional. So in conclusion, questions should drive assessments. There's many methods, many models to choose from. The challenge is really to pick the right suite of methods for your study question. Whether a method works or not is really based upon whether it was incorporated into an overall process of sound science, ecological principles, and a documented process that looks at very specific needs. So that's really important to point out. And moving forward, Department of Fish and Wildlife Flow Program, we continue to work with the board and others to try to explore new ways to evaluate flow data. There are lots of ways to do that. We're hoping to move away from, the efforts that we have been doing on the really intensive site-specific studies and work with the earlier groups at developing more of a statewide framework to develop flow criteria. I do want to let you know about the Instream Flow Council has a meeting coming up next year. These are really good meetings. We've got a really great lineup of speakers. Some of them are from California. The focus of this particular meeting is on drought, so it's highly relevant. If you can make it, it's in Fort Collins, Colorado next year. Hope to see you there. With that, thank you. There's my contact information, and we'll do it. Thanks.